Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Dr. Moshe Sokol, who is Dean of the Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Torah University, and he's also Rabbi of the Yavne Minyan of Flatbush. And we'll be discussing his new book, A Mysterious Guest for Dinner, Exploring Talmudic Narratives, which is focused on Aggados, is published by Maggid and Torah University. And it's the second in the series, if you will. We had Rabbi Dr. Sokol was on the first time about his first book, The Snake at the Mouth of the Cave, also published by Maggid and Torah. And so now we're here on SmallTalk to discuss the sequel. So thank you for joining me once again.
My pleasure. It's good to be with you.
Okay, so let's start off and tell the listeners about this volume, this second volume in this series, if you will.
Okay, well, the second volume is pretty much the same as the first volume, except that it has entirely different subject matter. By that I mean, the first volume was an analysis of 8 Aggadic narratives, 8 Sipurei Aggadah, stories in the Aggadata. And I decided to continue and do an additional 10 analyses. So same method, same approach, but it's new in that it's entirely new material. In that respect, it's new, but it's still the same approach, same guy.
So for a fuller conversation, go back to the first episode that we did, and you'll listen to be able to hear more about your methodology and things like that.
I'll be happy to talk about it again if you wish.
Yeah, well, if you want to just in brief to recap, just so that listeners can remember, just in brief to recap, what it is that you're looking to do in that book and then in this book, and then we'll pick out some of the examples and some of the Aggadah Gemaras that you focused on here in this volume.
What I tried to do in the last volume and this volume is to take Aggadahs that tell stories with the same level of rigor, care, seriousness, being medayik in the lashon that one uses to learn any Gemara. Many of your listeners, myself included, spent many, many years in yeshiva, and we were taught to take every word carefully. Why does it say this? Why does it say this? Why does it do this? We're taught to interrogate the text in a very, very careful way. Typically, when we learn Sipurei Aggadah, Aggadic narrative stories, we kind of zip through it, or we just like, well, there's the Marsha, and you go ahead. But if we were to pay the same attention to these stories, these Aggadahs that we would pay to a typical sugya, we would never do that. And to me, that seems self-contradictory, because it's the same Gemara, the same Amarayim, or the same Tanayim, and if we take one seriously, we should take the other seriously as well. So my passion is to look as deeply as I possibly can at the stories the Gemara tells, and Gemara takes it seriously. We should do the same and try to unpack layer after layer after layer of meaning that I believe inheres in the story, because there are often contradictions and problems and questions that we just kind of slide over. But if we didn't slide over them, we would be struck by them. Like, why is that? Why does he do that? Why does he say that? That doesn't make any sense. How is that possible? And once we interrogate the Gemara like we would do a typical Gemara, we discover that the Tanaim and Amarayim, they were people of extraordinary wisdom, deep insight, and I have Emunah Shlema. I'm convinced that they have deep messages that they want to convey. If it were just a little story, superficial, okay, I wouldn't say that. But they're so complicated. The more you analyze them, and they're so problematized by the way they put them, and they knew what they were doing. They certainly did. And so what do they mean to tell us? And so that's what started my project off. Stories are interesting. They grab everybody's attention, which is why they're in the Gemara, which is why at some level stories preoccupy, the Torah. Much of the Torah is full of stories. So why the stories? Why isn't the Torah written like Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa? Because stories are important. And that's how we kind of gain insight. And I've also found that the messages I believe these Aggadahs, at least in my opinion, seek to convey, really respond to fundamental human dilemmas that all human beings at some level or other face. The meaning of life, right and wrong, how do you treat other people, to what extent are we responsible for the implications of our actions, even if they were unintended. Classic dilemmas that all human beings face. And I think that Chazal were seeking to share with us their wisdom about how we can elevate our lives and be more self-conscious and aware of what we do and why we do it and what we should be doing with our lives. Let me add just one little point, if I might, which is that there is a literature of Mefarshim on Aggados, not like I invented the genre. There's the Enyakov, which is a number of classical Mefarshim, and many, many other Mefarshim, even if they weren't focused exclusively on the Aggadah, did comment on the Aggadah. And here's what I found. I found that these Mefarshim often had incredibly valuable insights. They have vast knowledge of Shas and of Midrashim, and they brought that to bear in their reading of the Aggadah. But, and here's the big but, I live in the 21st century now, and certain methods or approaches appeal to me as a product of the century and decades in which I live, which such that what they did in, say, 16th century Poland isn't as meaningful to me. For them, it was a great parish, but for somebody living in my generation, not such a great parish, or not that it's not a great parish, it doesn't speak to me. It doesn't work for me. Just like, for example, I use this example in the introduction to the book, somebody who is trained in the brisker derech of learning is not going to be satisfied with the Polish pilpul of the 17th and 16th century, which isn't to denigrate the godless of those Mefarshim. They were obviously terrific and great. It's just a different derech. And so I try to bring to bear my sensibilities, the knowledge that I obtained not only in yeshiva, but in university, to bring to bear a full range of perspectives, history, literature, literary methods of analysis, philosophical analysis, to try to come up with a parish that works for me. If it works for somebody else, that's terrific, but I try to do what I can such that it works for me.
So in the small time we have here to discuss some of the examples, I'll jump to chapter 9, because that's something that is interesting. I've always been talking about Aggadah. It's to some extent on people's minds, which is, as you title it, interpreting fantastical Aggadot, the giant who tried to slay King David. So you're talking about Sanhedrin 95a, and you're talking about in Mesech Sanhedrin over there, where David HaMelech is chased by a giant, the brother of Goliath, and then he's chased, and suddenly Avishai comes to save him, and then the mother throws something, the giant throws something at, she throws at the giant, and there's a whole lengthy story over there. So first of all, it's interesting you pick this Aggadah, talking about fantastical Aggadah. Obviously, you can go through all the Rabbi Barbachanas and all of many Aggadahs to, come Rabbi Shachtel, Rabbi Zera, etc., etc. But why did you pick this one? You could talk about this story specifically, and also your approach in general when dealing with, as you term it, fantastical Aggadas. Okay,
great question. So the reason I chose this is because, to be perfectly frank, I felt I had something to say about it. That's a good place to start. In other words, I came across this Aggadah. I was teaching the Gemara where it appears, and so I came across it, was struck by it. And the more and more I thought about it, the more I felt that I had my own derech to explain it, and the extent to which that can be extrapolated for other Aggadahs, great. Doesn't work for every Aggadah. But I use this as a case study in dealing with Aggadahs that appear surreal, like David HaMelech is thrown up in the air, and then the Shem HaMefarsh is mentioned, and he's hanging up in the air above the sword that Yishbi is ready to have him land on it. There are many, many strange elements to the Aggadah. And how do you approach surreal stories like that? So I identify a number of different approaches that our classical Mefarshim over the years have taken. There's the literalist approach, like Rashi often follows that. Just this is actually what happened. Then there is what I call the figurative approach, which is that the stories are allegories for grand, larger concerns. Maral would be a perfect example of an allegorist who reads this Aggadah and other Aggadahs as allegories about the battle between Chomer and Surah and Tov and Ra, good and bad, and form and material objects. And he's got a whole kind of philosophical, Kabbalistic framework, which the stories are allegories for. And he actually interprets this Aggadah as well. So that's another method. The problem for me with the allegorical method is that it takes the reader away from the story. In other words, the story becomes a cipher for a larger drama of a metaphysical kind of nature. But the story itself, for me anyway, seems to have its own valence. It has characters. David is in there, and Tishbi is in there. Who are all these people, and what are they busy? Yishbi, and what are they busy with, and what bothers them? No, they're human beings that are the subject of this story. And the problem with this whole approach is that it takes you away from the story. As a literalist reading, I don't deny the validity of that. It's people who follow that Gesundheit, as they say in Yiddish. That's perfectly fine. It's their prerogative. It doesn't speak to me. So for these reasons, both the literalist and the allegorical method don't really speak to me. So what does speak to me? So I came across some Mefarshim, some Gaonim, the Ritva, others who often interpret these kinds of fantastical Aggadas as occurring in a dream. They are dream sequences. Now, I thought that was an extraordinarily fertile method to look at for the following reason. What do we dream about? Well, the Gemara in Bracha says, and this is true, that at least sometimes we dream about what's on our mind. Something's on our mind during the daytime, then it emerges in our dreams. You don't need to be a Freudian psychoanalyst to take that view. We all know that, what you're worried about or thinking about during the day sometimes pops up in your dream. So this dream method of analysis provides a portal for us to analyze the inner challenges, conflicts, moral dilemmas that the characters in the Aggadata are struggling with. It makes it human. It brings it down to them, and it provides a rich framework to understand the challenges that these Aggadas explain, not symbolically or allegorically, but what's sort of on their, shall we say, subconscious mind. So it's real in the sense that we're entering into their mind as the author of the Aggadata might want us to do. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not claiming that these are literally dreams that, say, David HaMelech had. The author of the Aggadata either believed that it was a dream or wrote the story as if it were a dream, because that was the way the author of the Aggadata felt he could best convey what he thought was going on in David HaMelech's mind. Now, nobody knows what's going on in David HaMelech's mind because David HaMelech was David HaMelech, and we can't ask him for two reasons, But we're looking at the Aggadata, and this is what the text says. Our job as Talmidim, as people who learn Aggadata or learn Gemara, is try to figure out what the Gemara says. So our job is to figure out what the meaning of this story is, and either the author thought that David HaMelech was dreaming this, or conjectured, or imagined, doesn't make any difference to me, because this is the text, and since I have major Mefarshim, Rishonim, and Gaonim who allow for such an analysis, I thought it was an extraordinarily valuable method for getting into the heart and soul, according to the author of the Aggadata, of what was going on in the minds of the protagonists in the story. I make no claims about David HaMelech, nothing. And who can imagine what David HaMelech's like or any of the Tanaim or Amoraim? I don't know what they're like. All I have is a Gemara. My job is to try to figure out what the Gemara means.
Of all the Aggadas discussed in this book here, this second volume, believe there's 10. Do you have a favorite? Is there a favorite?
That's a great question. I thought you might ask me that. I don't really have a favorite. I'll tell you, it's like, Nachi, how many kids do you have?
4. Can I know?
4. Do you have a favorite? No. You love them all. They're all different. They're all your kids, and you love them all. So the Aggadas are not my kids, but I chose Aggadas that I was really fascinated by, impassioned by, and I felt that the Aggadas that I chose to analyze were very complicated, way more complicated than you might imagine by just reading them quickly. And I thought that the messages that they conveyed were extremely resonant for all human beings living in the world and trying to make sense out of the world in which they live. So I don't really have a favorite. I named the book A Mysterious Guest for Dinner. Maybe I'll explain why I chose that. It's based on one of the chapters. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. It's certainly a fantastic Aggadata. It just gives you an idea of, this is like, what is going on? So Rav Yanai meets this person on the road, and he is so impressed with him by his looks that he invites him for dinner. according to the Mefarshim, he seems like a real Talmid Chacham, somebody with great dignity, great stature. So he meets him on the road and he invites him for dinner. That's a little puzzling in and of itself. Like, you may meet somebody on the road, doesn't mean you invite them for dinner. So why did that happen? Then he interrogates him at dinner over Chumash and Aggados, by the way, and Gemara. And he turns out to be totally ignorant. So he says, okay, go bench. So the guest says, bench? You bench. You're the Baal Bayis. And so Rav Yanai understands that to mean that he can't even bench. And so he says, okay, can you repeat after me if I say something? And the guest says, okay. So he says, repeat after me. A dog ate at Yanai's table. So basically, Rav Yanai was calling him a dog. Now, we all have our foibles, but this is Rav Yanai, and for him to call a guest a dog is like shocking in the extreme. Like what's his hava mean? He eventually does tshuva. I realize he shouldn't have done that, but for different reasons, sort of. But why would he do that? So that's very, very puzzling. And then the story gets even more complicated. He says he grabs Rav Yanai by his coat. And he says, you're stealing. Well, you think the Torah is only yours. The Torah is mine too. I was once passing by I heard some Tinoko Shabesh Rabban learning, and they repeated the pasuk, Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Mora Shakilas Yaakov. And they said, Kilas Yaakov. It doesn't say Kilas Yanai. It says Kilas Yaakov. The Torah is also mine. Now, if you think about this guy's such an ignoramus that he can't even bench. He is going to dafka remember Torah, Tziva, and then this is a classic rabbinic move. It says Yaakov and not Yanai. So, that's not something that a super Aretz is going to do. It requires great memory, perfectly apt recall of a totally relevant pasuk, and the play on words, which is a classic rabbinic method of, kind of sticking it at somebody. What is this guy? It's such an Aretz? It doesn't make any sense. So what it first seemed like there was this Talmid Chacham looking person who was an imposter because he was really an Aretz. But the more you analyze what he says, the more you realize that there's a double impostoring, because he is acting as if he's an Aretz and can't even bench, when in fact he's pretty learned. He seems to be pretty learned. And then he goes on, I can't get into the whole dialogue because it's kind of involved, but he goes on to make claims that he says, Rav Yanai says, I see you're a Baal Derech Eretz, and the question about Derech Eretz and Torah, which I'm not going to get into right now, and the relationship between the two, which is quite interesting, but he says, yes, I am, and I'll prove it to you, because when people, according to one interpretation, when people embarrass me, I never, responded. I just absorbed the embarrassment. That's what he says, according to one of the Mefarshim. Well, it's not true. What does he do when Rav Yanai has him say, a dog ate at my table? He grabs Rav Yanai aggressively and violently by the coat. So his behavior belies his own explanation. So you have this extremely convoluted, multiply puzzling, self-contradictory Aggadah. Now, the author of this Aggadah knew what he was doing. So why does he present it in such convolutions? And to make a very long story short, read the whole chapter. But what I want to argue is, what I wanted to suggest is that what the author of the Aggadah is, I think, brilliantly teaching us in a very complex way, and I'm just summarizing a very complex idea, that this imposter of an imposter is really teaching Rav Yanai, and therefore all the readers, that human beings are complicated. And we all wear masks. And there are multiple masks that we wear. And therefore we must take every human being seriously, because we don't really know who that person really is. What is he, a Talmid Chacham? Is he an Aretz? Is an Aretz masquerading as a Talmid Chacham? A Talmid Chacham masking as an Aretz? If you meet somebody you need to respect that person's humanity, because you could never penetrate to the ultimate mysteries that constitute the human condition. I mean, now you and I are talking. You don't really know me. I don't really know you. We can get to know each other better. But do I know you as a father? Even if we got to know each other better, as a husband, as a son? There are many masks that we wear, many dimensions to our complicated identities. And I think that this brilliant Aggadah elucidates and illuminates the complexity of the human condition and demands that we take every human being seriously, because we can never know who that person is. Talmid Chacham or ignoramus. He was created with Tselem Elokim. And that's how the Aggadah ends, which I'm not going to get into. But that's it's a powerful message, I think. And that is a way I try to make sense of all the contradictions and the convolutions and the ironic twists of this fascinating story. But I titled the book following that story, because what I want to suggest is that all Aggadahs are mysterious guests at the dinner table of anybody who learns Gemara. We don't really understand them. They're mysterious. They're guests. They're at our dinner table. And just like it behooved us to try to unpack the complexities and the ironic reversals of this Aggadah, Chazal said, hey, lots of Aggadahs, work on them. There's wisdom there.
Fascinating. So that is a chapter in the book, and that's why, like you said, a mysterious guest for dinner, which is nice that you named the book and the first one as well. You gave it a name, not just like studies, essays on, Talmudic Aggadot or something like boring. It's actually exciting. It has a name that grabs you. So
that was the idea.
Yes, and it really, I think you accomplished that goal. So in closing, who would you say this book is meant for?
Great question. I will tell you what I hope whom I hope it's meant for. Whether that works for everybody, I can't say. But I wanted the book to resonate with people who are serious learners of Gemara, but even people who have no exposure to Gemara at all, male or female, because the stories speak for themselves. They're in the book, as you've noted in the past. There's the original, text, and then there's the translation. That I have a little introduction. Then there's the text, so the reader can read the Aggadah and see the translation. And then I have a running commentary on it. So I think people who've learned Gemara will appreciate it, but I think it can be appreciated by anybody who has an intellectual openness and curiosity and willing to follow along with me as I try to unpeel layer after layer of deeper meanings of the Aggadah based upon the complexities and the contradictions and the problems that a careful reading will reveal. So I can even imagine a non-Orthodox person reading it if they're really interested in figuring out what the Gemara has to talk about. But I guess I found the first book, I got most responses from people who spend a lot of time learning, but many people who have no exposure to Gemara at all told me they found it fascinating. And like women who've never learned Gemara, a more right-wing background, people on the right and on the left, I found in the comments I got from people, by email. And in the reviews, it was reviewed by Hamodia and by the Jerusalem Post, a wide variety of publications reflecting different kinds of readers. So that's my hope, to bring the wisdom of Chazal to as broad an audience as possible.
Okay, I will link to this volume as well as the first volume in the show's notes, and I'll also try to link to the first episode we did for those that want a fuller, fleshed out episode where we went through the first book more in depth. And so with that, thank you for joining me once again.
And thank you for having me, and good luck to you.